Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into an emotional royal drama filled with betrayal, sacrifice, shocking twists, and long-awaited justice. Imagine dedicating 10 years of your life to creating a medical breakthrough that could save countless lives, only to return home and be treated like a stranger by the very family you trusted. That is exactly what happens in today's unforgettable story. Our story follows Queen Margaret, a brilliant scientist and a respected queen who spends an entire decade in the frozen wilderness of Antarctica. While the rest of the world moves on, she devotes every single day to one mission: extracting the world's first and only life enzyme, a revolutionary discovery capable of curing rare diseases that were once considered impossible to treat. Her success is celebrated as one of the greatest scientific achievements of the century, and the entire nation eagerly waits for her return. But instead of receiving the welcome she deserves, Margaret walks into a nightmare. Hidden behind the luxurious walls of the royal family are greed, arrogance, and people who believe power places them above the law. The king's adopted children have grown up surrounded by privilege, yet they have forgotten the values of kindness, gratitude, and responsibility. Blinded by their ambition to inherit the throne, they see every person as either a stepping stone or an obstacle. Without realizing it, they are about to commit the greatest mistake of their lives. As fate brings them face to face with their own queen, they fail to recognize her humble appearance after years of hardship and scientific research. What follows is a heartbreaking chain of humiliation, cruelty, violence, and irreversible decisions that push Margaret to the edge. Even when she repeatedly tells them the truth, no one believes her. Instead of offering respect, they respond with insults. Instead of showing gratitude, they answer with brutality. Every cruel action they take only pulls them closer to their own downfall. Fortunately, not everyone has forgotten what it means to stand for justice. A courageous woman named Catherine refuses to abandon a helpless stranger, even when it means risking her own safety. While others choose power over humanity, Catherine chooses compassion. Her loyalty becomes a shining light during the darkest moments of the story and proves that true nobility is measured by character rather than status. Meanwhile, King Edward has no idea that the woman he has been waiting for is suffering only a few miles away because of the very children he raised. As misunderstandings grow into tragedy, hidden truths begin to surface. Lies become impossible to hide forever, evidence starts to appear, and every decision made out of greed creates consequences that no amount of wealth or influence can erase. This is not just a story about a queen returning home. It is a story about justice defeating corruption, truth overcoming deception, and kindness proving stronger than cruelty. It reminds us that titles and power mean nothing without integrity, and that every action, whether good or evil, eventually comes back to the person who chooses it. So sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end, because this royal drama is packed with emotional moments, unexpected twists, unforgettable characters, and a powerful ending where every secret is revealed, every crime is exposed, and everyone finally receives exactly what they deserve. Now, without wasting any more time, let's begin the story from the very first moment Queen Margaret returns home after 10 long years in Antarctica. The story begins with breaking news spreading across the entire nation. Every television station interrupts its regular programs to report a historic scientific achievement. After spending 10 long years in the freezing wilderness of Antarctica, Queen Margaret has successfully extracted the world's first and only life enzyme, a miraculous discovery that scientists believe can cure several rare diseases that were once considered impossible to treat. The announcement shocks the medical community, and people everywhere celebrate the Queen's incredible dedication. For an entire decade, she sacrificed her comfort, her health, and even her personal happiness to complete a mission that could save countless lives. Her return is described as the greatest medical breakthrough of the century, and everyone eagerly waits to welcome their beloved queen home. However, no one realizes that the hero returning to the kingdom is no longer the same woman who left 10 years earlier. Endless years in the harsh polar climate have changed her appearance, weakened her body, and taken away the possibility of ever having children. Yet despite everything she has lost, Margaret never regrets the sacrifices she made, because she believes saving innocent lives is worth every painful moment. As the plane finally lands, Margaret quietly steps out carrying an ordinary-looking metal case. To everyone else, it appears to be nothing more than a small suitcase, but inside rests the priceless life enzyme that took nearly a decade to create. There is only one bottle in the entire world, making it more valuable than any treasure hidden inside the royal palace. Margaret smiles gently as she breathes the familiar air of her homeland for the first time in years. She is not thinking about celebrations or royal ceremonies. Instead, she is thinking about seeing her husband, King Edward, again after such a long separation. She also wonders how the 3 royal children have grown during the years she was away. Although they are adopted, Margaret has always loved and cared for them as if they were her own. Before leaving for Antarctica, she personally helped raise them, hoping they would become compassionate leaders who would serve the kingdom with kindness and wisdom. Because of the dangerous conditions of her research, she gave up the chance to build a normal family, believing those children would someday carry the future of the royal family with honor. Waiting nearby is one of the king's trusted assistants, who immediately greets Margaret with deep respect. He happily informs her that King Edward has been making preparations for her return and that a press conference has already been arranged for the following week. During that event, the entire world will witness the official introduction of the life enzyme and learn about its life-saving potential. The assistant also explains that the king's eldest and second adopted children have been sent to the airport to welcome her personally, while the youngest child remains in the hospital because of a rare illness. Margaret listens carefully before quietly revealing a heartbreaking truth. The unbearable cold she endured for so many years permanently damaged her health, leaving her unable to have children of her own. There is sadness in her voice, but no bitterness. Instead, she thanks fate for allowing her to raise the 3 adopted children. She sincerely hopes they have grown into responsible and compassionate adults. When the assistant asks whether she has decided who should become the future heir to the throne, Margaret smiles thoughtfully. She explains that such an important decision cannot be made based on reports alone. She wants to observe each child personally before choosing who truly deserves to inherit the kingdom. Leadership, she believes, should never be decided by bloodline alone, but by honesty, kindness, and integrity. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the airport, the atmosphere is completely different. The king's adopted sons are not excited because their mother is finally returning after 10 years. Instead, they are obsessed with the opportunity to gain political advantage. They proudly display an expensive sapphire necklace they intend to present to the queen, believing such a flashy gift will guarantee her favor. Their conversation quickly reveals their true personalities. Rather than discussing how much they have missed Margaret or expressing gratitude for everything she sacrificed, they openly talk about money, gambling debts, and the enormous influence that comes with controlling the royal foundation. They believe whoever impresses the queen today will almost certainly become the next heir to the throne. One brother confidently declares that once he gains the queen's trust, every financial problem facing their family will disappear forever. Another quietly reminds him that if they gain enough authority, no one will ever discover the dark secrets they have been hiding. Their words expose their greed long before the audience witnesses their cruelty. The brothers suddenly realize they have never actually seen Queen Margaret in person because she has spent the last decade isolated in Antarctica. They are not worried, however, because they are carrying a large welcome sign with her name written on it. They arrogantly assume the queen will recognize them immediately. As they impatiently wait near the arrival gate, Margaret chooses not to attract unnecessary attention. She politely refuses special treatment and carries her own suitcase instead of allowing anyone else to touch it. To ordinary travelers, she appears to be nothing more than a tired middle-aged woman dressed in simple clothes after a long international flight. Years of scientific research have left her exhausted, and the scars of extreme weather make her look much older than her real age. Ironically, the very appearance created by her years of sacrifice will soon become the reason no one believes her true identity. Fate suddenly takes an unexpected turn. Near the airport entrance, a young man accidentally loses control and crashes into Margaret. The impact throws both of them to the ground, and the precious suitcase slips from her hands. Before Margaret can even recover from the painful fall, the sapphire necklace carried by one of the princes is damaged during the confusion. Instead of asking whether the elderly woman is injured, the prince explodes with uncontrollable anger. He immediately blames Margaret for destroying the expensive gift and begins shouting at her in front of everyone. Calmly, Margaret explains that the accident was not intentional and that neither of them was watching where they were going. But the prince refuses to listen. His pride has been wounded, and his desire to impress the queen has suddenly been threatened. In his eyes, the frightened stranger standing before him is no longer a human being, but simply someone to blame for his own bad luck. Without realizing it, the adopted prince has just begun the series of terrible decisions that will eventually destroy everything he has ever dreamed of achieving. The prince's furious voice echoed across the airport terminal, instantly drawing the attention of dozens of travelers. People stopped walking and turned toward the growing argument, unsure of what had happened. Margaret slowly pushed herself off the ground, ignoring the pain spreading through her body. 10 years of working in Antarctica had already left her physically weak, and the unexpected fall only made things worse. Even so, her first concern was not herself. She quickly looked toward the metal case that had slipped from her hands. Relief washed over her face when she saw that it had not opened. Inside that simple-looking case rested the world's only life enzyme, the result of 10 years of sacrifice. If anything happened to it, millions of future patients could lose their only hope for survival. Margaret carefully reached for the case, but before she could touch it, the eldest prince stepped in front of her with a furious expression. Instead of showing concern for an injured woman, he glared at her as if she had committed an unforgivable crime. According to him, the sapphire necklace she had supposedly damaged was priceless, and no ordinary person could ever afford to replace it. Margaret remained calm and sincerely offered to compensate him if the necklace had truly been broken by accident. However, the prince laughed at her offer, claiming that even if she worked for the rest of her life, she could never repay its value. His words revealed not only his arrogance, but also the complete lack of compassion hidden beneath his royal title. The situation quickly became even more dangerous. Without giving Margaret any chance to explain, the prince ordered his loyal assistant, James, to hold her in place. The frightened crowd watched in silence as James grabbed the elderly woman by the arm. Margaret struggled to keep her balance, but she refused to let go of the precious case. Every instinct told her that protecting the life enzyme was more important than protecting herself. She had endured endless snowstorms, months of isolation, and years of exhausting scientific work to create it. She could not allow it to be destroyed by a meaningless airport dispute. The prince, however, cared about none of those sacrifices. He believed Margaret had ruined the opportunity to impress the queen, and in his mind, that was a crime deserving punishment. His anger was driven not by justice, but by selfish ambition. He imagined himself becoming the next ruler of the kingdom, and anyone standing in the way of that dream immediately became his enemy. Just as the prince prepared to strike Margaret again, a firm voice interrupted the confrontation. A young airport security guard named Catherine stepped forward without hesitation. Unlike everyone else standing nearby, Catherine could not ignore what she was witnessing. She had sworn an oath to protect innocent people, regardless of their social status. Looking directly at the prince, she calmly reminded him that assaulting a disabled woman was both immoral and illegal. Her words immediately caught everyone's attention. For the first time since the argument had begun, someone had dared to challenge the prince's authority. Instead of feeling ashamed, however, he burst into laughter. He proudly announced that he was a prince of the royal family and claimed that his wealth and influence placed him above ordinary laws. In his eyes, people like Catherine existed only to obey the powerful. He mocked her uniform and dismissed her courage as meaningless. Yet Catherine refused to move. She stood between Margaret and the prince, determined to protect a complete stranger despite knowing she could lose her job for confronting a member of the royal family. Margaret watched the brave young guard with quiet admiration. During her years away from the kingdom, she had often wondered whether kindness still existed among her people. Catherine's fearless actions answered that question. Even though Margaret had not revealed her identity, Catherine defended her simply because it was the right thing to do. That single decision would eventually change both of their lives forever. The prince, on the other hand, saw Catherine's interference as a personal insult. He threatened to ruin her career and make sure she would never work anywhere in London again. Catherine remained remarkably calm. She reminded him once more that Britain was a nation governed by law and that no prince had the right to abuse innocent citizens. Hearing those words only made the prince angrier. He proudly declared that everything in the country belonged to his father and mother, meaning that no one had the authority to question him. His arrogance shocked many of the bystanders, but fear prevented anyone else from speaking. The confrontation soon became physical again. The prince stepped closer to Margaret and angrily declared that she had destroyed his future. He believed the damaged necklace had ruined his chance to impress Queen Margaret and become the next heir to the throne. Margaret listened silently, unable to believe what she was hearing. She had spent years hoping the children she helped raise would become compassionate leaders, yet the man standing before her cared only about power, wealth, and inheritance. Even worse, he considered violence an acceptable solution to every problem. Looking into his eyes, Margaret saw none of the kindness she had hoped to nurture years earlier. Instead, she saw only greed. Quietly, she whispered that a person with such a cruel heart could never deserve to rule the kingdom. The prince laughed at her words, assuming they came from an ordinary woman who knew nothing about the royal family. He had no idea that the person criticizing him was the very queen whose opinion mattered most. Far away from the airport confrontation, another member of the royal family was preparing to leave the hospital. Princess Charlotte, the youngest adopted child, had been receiving treatment for the rare illness that threatened her life. Doctors had exhausted every available option, and only the newly developed life enzyme offered real hope for a cure. Despite feeling physically weak, Charlotte insisted on traveling to the airport herself. She desperately wanted to welcome Queen Margaret and personally thank the scientist whose discovery could save her life. King Edward initially urged her to rest, but Charlotte politely refused. She believed meeting the Queen was too important to miss. Before ending their phone conversation, the king mentioned that none of the adopted children had ever seen Margaret in person. To prevent any misunderstanding, he promised to send them a recent photograph of the Queen as soon as possible. Back at the airport, however, events continued moving toward disaster. The eldest prince became increasingly impatient and finally raised his hand once more, threatening to beat Margaret until she could never stand again. Calmly, Margaret warned him that King Edward would never forgive such behavior if he learned the truth. The prince simply laughed. Confident that his father would always protect him, he proudly declared that his father was the king while she was nothing more than a powerless commoner. For the first time since arriving home, Margaret decided there was no reason to remain silent. Looking directly into the prince's eyes, she spoke with quiet confidence and revealed the truth. She told him that she was the very person he had come to welcome, Queen Margaret herself. Instead of reacting with shock, the prince and his companions burst into uncontrollable laughter. They dismissed her words as the desperate lies of a frightened old woman. Because the Queen had spent 10 years hidden away in Antarctica, they believed no ordinary person could possibly know what she looked like. They mocked Margaret without realizing that every insult they spoke was directed toward the Queen of their own kingdom, bringing themselves one step closer to a downfall from which there would be no escape. Margaret's unexpected declaration left the people standing nearby completely silent for a brief moment. "I am Queen Margaret," she repeated calmly, hoping that at least one person would stop and think before acting. But instead of believing her, the eldest prince and his companions burst into loud laughter. To them, the idea seemed ridiculous. The queen they had imagined was a graceful royal woman arriving in luxury, surrounded by guards, wearing expensive clothes and royal jewelry. The tired woman standing in front of them looked nothing like the image they had created in their minds. Years of surviving the freezing Antarctic climate had left Margaret looking older and physically exhausted. Her simple clothes, tired face, and damaged legs made her appear like an ordinary traveler rather than the most respected woman in the kingdom. The prince pointed at her with a mocking smile and claimed that anyone could pretend to be the queen because she had been away from the public for 10 years. He accused Margaret of inventing a desperate lie simply to escape punishment. Every insult that came from his mouth made the crowd even more uncomfortable, but no one dared challenge a member of the royal family. Margaret took a slow breath and tried one final time to make them understand. She explained that the harsh conditions in Antarctica had permanently changed her appearance. Endless snowstorms, freezing temperatures, and years of scientific work had taken a terrible toll on her health. She reminded them that true identity was not determined by expensive clothes or beautiful jewelry. A queen could sacrifice everything for her country and still return wearing nothing more than simple clothing. But her words fell on deaf ears. The prince proudly declared that Queen Margaret was a national hero and a world-famous scientist, while the woman standing before him looked like nothing more than a poor traveler. In his mind, the difference between appearance and reality was impossible to accept. His arrogance prevented him from seeing the truth even when it stood directly in front of him. At that moment, Catherine carefully stepped closer to Margaret. Unlike everyone else, she had been listening closely to every word. There was something about Margaret's calm confidence that made Catherine hesitate. Most people caught in such a dangerous situation would panic or beg for mercy, but Margaret never lost her dignity. Even while injured and surrounded by hostile people, she continued speaking with remarkable composure. Catherine quietly whispered that she believed Margaret might actually be telling the truth. Before she could say anything more, the prince turned toward her with an expression full of anger. He accused Catherine of helping an impostor deceive the royal family. According to him, anyone supporting Margaret deserved the same punishment. Catherine refused to back away. She firmly replied that no innocent person should be abused before their identity had even been confirmed. Her courage only increased the prince's hatred toward both women. Meanwhile, several kilometers away, Princess Charlotte finally left the hospital despite her fragile condition. She still believed she could personally welcome Queen Margaret before returning for treatment. During the journey, King Edward called once again to check on her condition. He reminded Charlotte that Margaret had spent 10 years away from public life and looked different than she had before leaving for Antarctica. To avoid any misunderstanding, he promised to send a recent photograph immediately. Charlotte agreed and prepared to receive it, completely unaware that the Queen had already arrived and was being humiliated by her own adopted siblings. Fate was creating a heartbreaking situation where the people searching for Margaret were unknowingly standing only a few steps away from her without recognizing her face. Back at the airport, the eldest prince became impatient. He believed wasting another minute arguing with the old woman would only delay his opportunity to welcome the real queen. Furious that Margaret continued claiming to be Queen Margaret, he ordered James to seize the metal case she was protecting so desperately. Margaret's expression instantly changed. Until that moment, she had tolerated every insult and every threat without responding violently. But the case contained the only life enzyme ever created, the result of 10 years of research that could save countless lives. She stepped forward and desperately pleaded with them not to touch it. Her voice carried genuine fear for the first time since arriving home. She explained that what rested inside the case was beyond price and that damaging it would become a tragedy for the entire country. Instead of listening, the prince became even more suspicious. He assumed the case contained evidence proving Margaret was a fraud and decided he would open it by force. Just then, another vehicle arrived near the airport entrance. Charlotte finally reached the scene after leaving the hospital. She immediately noticed the growing crowd and hurried toward the commotion. Seeing the injured woman covered with dust and blood, Charlotte frowned with disgust rather than sympathy. She had expected to meet a respected scientist, not an exhausted stranger. Before Margaret even had a chance to speak, the eldest prince rushed over and confidently explained that the woman had smashed the sapphire necklace, insulted the royal family, and was pretending to be Queen Margaret. Charlotte looked carefully at Margaret's face. For a brief second, uncertainty crossed her expression. The woman looked strangely familiar, almost like the photograph her father had once shown years ago. She quietly admitted that the stranger looked somewhat similar to Queen Margaret. Her words caused the other princes to hesitate for the first time. Excited by the possibility of confirming the truth, one of them quickly reached for his phone. King Edward had promised to send a recent photograph, and everyone believed that comparing the image would settle the argument instantly. But just as he attempted to open the message, the phone battery died completely. The screen turned black, leaving them without the evidence they desperately needed. Rather than taking this as a sign to be cautious, the eldest prince immediately dismissed the possibility that Margaret could really be the queen. He argued that someone of such extraordinary status would never travel on an ordinary flight, wearing worn-out clothes and carrying her own luggage. The others eagerly agreed. Their judgment was based entirely on appearance instead of facts, proving once again how easily pride can blind intelligent people. Margaret watched them quietly, feeling more disappointed than angry. She remembered the little children she had once cared for before leaving for Antarctica. Back then, she believed they would grow into honorable adults capable of leading the kingdom with wisdom and compassion. Instead, the people standing before her measured human worth by clothing, wealth, and social status. Looking at them with sadness, she wondered where everything had gone wrong. These were Margaret's heartbreaking disappointment quickly turned into determination. Looking at the 3 adopted children standing before her, she realized they were nothing like the kind-hearted youngsters she had left behind 10 years ago. Power had poisoned their hearts, and wealth had convinced them that ordinary people existed only to obey their commands. Even after hearing her repeated warnings, they refused to consider the possibility that she might truly be Queen Margaret. Instead, they mocked her appearance and treated her words as entertainment. The eldest prince stepped forward with a cruel smile and pointed at the metal case she was holding tightly. He was convinced that whatever Margaret was protecting had to be part of her deception. In his mind, exposing the contents of the case would humiliate her once and for all. Margaret immediately pulled it closer to her chest and begged them not to touch it. She explained that what rested inside was far more valuable than any jewel, palace, or royal treasure. It had taken an entire decade of research to create, and there was only one bottle in the entire world. Destroying it would not only ruin years of scientific work, but also take away the only hope for countless patients suffering from incurable diseases. Unfortunately, her desperate warning only made the prince even more suspicious. Charlotte stepped forward, still uncertain about the strange woman standing before her. For a brief moment, she remembered the conversation she had just had with King Edward. Her father had sounded unusually concerned and had repeatedly reminded her to treat Queen Margaret with respect. Deep inside, Charlotte wondered whether there was even the slightest chance this injured woman could be telling the truth. But before she could think any further, her older brother interrupted her. He confidently declared that Queen Margaret would never appear dressed like a poor traveler. According to him, someone of her status would arrive with luxury cars, royal guards, and a grand ceremony waiting outside the airport. He insisted that this woman was nothing more than a shameless fraud trying to fool the royal family. Hearing his confident words, Charlotte pushed her doubts aside. Instead of questioning her brother's judgment, she chose to believe him. That single decision would soon become one of the greatest regrets of her life. Margaret slowly lifted the case and looked directly at Charlotte. Her voice softened as she explained why the life enzyme mattered so much. She revealed that the medicine inside had been created especially for a young princess suffering from a rare illness. Every painful experiment, every sleepless night, and every sacrifice she had endured during the last 10 years had been motivated by one hope: to save that child's life. She gently asked Charlotte whether she knew anyone suffering from such a disease. Charlotte's expression changed slightly because she immediately realized the description matched her own condition perfectly. For another brief moment, silence filled the air. Margaret's knowledge seemed impossible for an ordinary stranger to possess. But before Charlotte could respond, the eldest prince laughed loudly and accused Margaret of inventing another clever lie after hearing the recent news reports. He claimed that everyone in Britain already knew Queen Margaret had returned with a miraculous medicine, making it easy for anyone to repeat those details. His explanation sounded convincing enough to satisfy the others, and once again the opportunity to discover the truth disappeared. The prince's patience finally ran out. He grabbed the case from Margaret's trembling hands despite her desperate attempts to stop him. Margaret's usually calm expression was suddenly filled with panic. For the first time, the crowd witnessed genuine fear in the eyes of the quiet woman they had mistaken for a beggar. She reached toward the case and pleaded with them not to damage it. She explained again that there would never be another bottle if this one was lost. Years of scientific research could not simply be repeated overnight. Every second of her life in Antarctica had been devoted to creating that single vial. But to the prince, the case represented nothing more than an opportunity to prove Margaret was lying. He waved it in front of the crowd while mocking her desperation. The spectators watched nervously, sensing that the situation had become far more serious than anyone had expected. Catherine could no longer remain silent. She stepped between Margaret and the prince once again and firmly demanded that he return the case immediately. She reminded him that taking another person's property by force was a crime regardless of social status. The prince's face darkened with anger. He had already grown tired of Catherine's repeated interference. Pointing directly at her, he warned that if she continued protecting the old woman, she would suffer the same punishment. Catherine knew she was risking everything, including her career and possibly her freedom, yet she refused to move. Looking at Margaret, she quietly said that even if the woman truly was just an ordinary traveler, no one deserved such cruel treatment. Those simple words deeply touched Margaret. After years spent surrounded only by snow, ice, and scientific equipment, finding one person willing to defend justice without expecting anything in return restored a small piece of her faith in humanity. Humiliated by Catherine's courage, the eldest prince decided to make an example of both women. He ordered James to hold Margaret while he slowly raised the case above his head. The crowd gasped, realizing he intended to smash whatever was inside. Margaret's heartbeat raced as she begged him to stop. She explained that the bottle inside represented the future of modern medicine and that destroying it would cost innocent lives. The prince smiled coldly before lowering the case slightly. He announced that perhaps he would spare it, but only if Margaret obeyed one humiliating condition. He demanded that she remove her clothes, kneel before him in front of everyone, and publicly admit she was a liar. Gasps spread through the airport. Even people who had remained silent until then looked horrified by the cruelty of the demand. Catherine immediately protested, calling the punishment inhuman. Charlotte also hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable, but she lacked the courage to oppose her brother openly. Margaret stood frozen, unable to believe what she had just heard. Throughout her entire life, she had represented the dignity of the royal family and the scientific community. She had spent 10 years sacrificing everything to protect the health of people she would never even meet. Now the children she had helped raise were demanding that she destroy her own dignity simply to satisfy their pride. She looked once more at the case containing the life enzyme. If the bottle shattered, Charlotte's only hope for survival would disappear, and countless future patients would lose the miracle she had created. Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment, silently weighing her own honor against the lives that depended on her research. At that painful moment, she realized she was about to make the greatest personal sacrifice of her entire life, not for herself, but for the very people who had chosen to become her enemies. These same children she had trusted with the future of the royal family, yet none of them possessed the qualities required to become a true ruler. At that painful moment, Margaret silently reached an important decision. Even if she survived the humiliation she was suffering today, she would never allow the throne to pass into the hands of people whose hearts had become so cold. Without realizing it, the adopted princes had already destroyed their own chance of ever becoming the future leaders of the kingdom. Margaret stood completely still as the cruel demand echoed through the airport terminal. For a few long seconds, no one spoke. The crowd looked from the arrogant prince to the exhausted woman standing before him. Unable to believe that a member of the royal family could humiliate a helpless stranger so publicly, Margaret lowered her eyes toward the metal case containing the life enzyme. Inside that small container rested 10 years of relentless sacrifice, endless sleepless nights, and unimaginable suffering. It was not simply a scientific discovery. It was the only hope for people battling diseases that modern medicine had never been able to cure. More importantly, it was the only treatment capable of saving Princess Charlotte's life. Margaret knew that if the bottle inside was shattered, thousands of future patients would lose their chance to survive. Her own dignity suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the lives depending on that single vial. Taking a slow, painful breath, she silently accepted that once again she would have to sacrifice herself for others. The eldest prince watched her hesitation with a satisfied smile. He believed fear had finally defeated her. To him, power meant forcing weaker people to obey, and he enjoyed every moment of watching someone lose their pride. "You have 3 seconds," he announced loudly so everyone around could hear. "Take off your clothes, kneel before me, and admit you're a liar, or I'll destroy whatever you're protecting." His voice was filled with confidence because he was convinced the old woman had no choice. James stood beside him holding the case tightly, ready to smash it onto the ground the moment the order was given. Around them, people exchanged nervous glances. Some wanted to intervene, but the prince's royal status frightened them into silence. They knew opposing him could destroy their own lives. Fear spread through the crowd almost as quickly as the prince's arrogance. Catherine stepped forward again, her face filled with anger. She could no longer tolerate the cruelty unfolding before her eyes. She demanded that the prince stop immediately, reminding him that humiliating a defenseless woman was both immoral and illegal. She warned him that every action had consequences, no matter how powerful someone believed they were. The prince slowly turned toward Catherine with an expression of pure contempt. He mocked her for speaking about justice while standing before the future ruler of the kingdom. According to him, ordinary people existed only to obey royal commands. Laws were for common citizens, not for princes. Catherine refused to lower her head. Looking directly into his eyes, she replied that true leadership was earned through compassion rather than fear. Her fearless words angered the prince even further, but they also inspired several people in the crowd, who quietly began realizing that Catherine was the only person brave enough to defend what was right. Margaret gently placed one hand on Catherine's shoulder and softly asked her not to argue any longer. She could see that Catherine's courage might cost her everything. Losing her position would be the least of her worries if the prince truly decided to take revenge. Catherine looked at Margaret with tears beginning to form in her eyes. She could not understand why this elderly woman remained so calm despite suffering such terrible humiliation. Margaret's kindness only strengthened Catherine's determination. She quietly promised that she would not abandon her, regardless of what happened next. Those simple words touched Margaret deeply. After spending 10 lonely years surrounded only by snow and ice, she had almost forgotten what genuine human kindness felt like. In that painful moment, Catherine reminded her that goodness still existed, even if it was hidden beneath fear. The eldest prince grew impatient. Believing Margaret was deliberately wasting time, he began counting down loudly. 3. His voice echoed across the terminal. Margaret looked once more at the precious case. She remembered every freezing night she had spent inside isolated research stations. She remembered the unbearable storms, the equipment failures, the loneliness, and the countless experiments that ended in failure before success finally arrived. She remembered collapsing from exhaustion, only to force herself back to work because millions of future patients depended on her. Most painfully of all, she remembered the day doctors informed her that prolonged exposure to the Antarctic climate had permanently destroyed her ability to have children. Everything she had lost had been exchanged for the tiny bottle now resting inside that case. If sacrificing her own dignity could protect it, then she would endure one final humiliation. 2. The prince continued, smiling even wider as he watched Margaret's trembling hands. Finally, with tears quietly forming in her eyes, Margaret nodded. In a voice barely above a whisper, she agreed to do what he demanded. A wave of shock passed through the crowd. Many people lowered their heads, unable to watch. Others looked away in shame, realizing that the elderly woman had surrendered not because she was weak, but because she was trying to protect something far greater than herself. The prince laughed triumphantly, believing he had completely broken her spirit. He proudly announced that everyone should watch the scene unfold, treating another human being's suffering like public entertainment. His heart had become so consumed by pride that he could no longer distinguish victory from cruelty. Just as Margaret slowly reached toward her coat, Catherine suddenly stepped in front of her. Her voice shook with emotion as she begged the prince to stop. If someone had to suffer humiliation, she said, then she would take Margaret's place. The airport fell silent once again. Catherine offered to sacrifice her own dignity to protect a woman she had known for only a few minutes. Margaret immediately refused, insisting that Catherine had already done more than enough. But Catherine would not move. She looked directly at the prince and repeated her offer, saying that innocent people should never be forced to pay for crimes they had never committed. Instead of showing mercy, the prince smiled cruelly. He declared that if Catherine wanted to help so badly, then both women could suffer together. His words shocked even his own siblings, who briefly exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, The younger adopted children began wondering whether their brother had gone too far. As the horrifying scene unfolded, neither Margaret nor Catherine noticed that events elsewhere were beginning to change. King Edward had repeatedly tried calling Margaret after receiving no response from her phone. Growing increasingly anxious, he sensed something was terribly wrong. Unable to ignore his instincts any longer, he immediately ordered his staff to prepare the royal convoy. He decided to travel to the airport personally to find his wife. At the same time, news of the disturbance at the terminal had already started spreading among airport security officers. Although no one yet realized the true identity of the injured woman, the chain of events that would expose every hidden lie had already begun. The adopted children believed they had complete control over the situation, but fate was quietly preparing the moment when every cruel decision they had made would return to them with devastating consequences. The airport terminal fell into complete silence after the prince's cruel decision. Even those who had remained silent from the beginning now struggled to hide the shock on their faces. What had started as an argument over a broken necklace had turned into public humiliation and abuse of power. Margaret slowly lowered her head, not because she had accepted defeat, but because she was thinking about the countless lives depending on the life enzyme. She knew that if the only vial in the world was destroyed, years of scientific progress would disappear in a single moment. Every patient waiting for hope would lose it forever. That painful thought gave her the strength to endure even the greatest insult. She quietly reminded herself that a true leader protects others, even when no one appreciates the sacrifice. Although tears filled her eyes, she refused to let hatred take control of her heart. Deep inside, she still wished the adopted children would realize their mistakes before it was too late. Standing beside her, Catherine felt completely helpless. She had never imagined that defending an elderly woman would lead to such a heartbreaking situation. Looking around, she noticed many people avoiding eye contact. Some wanted to help, but were terrified of challenging members of the royal family. Others silently recorded the incident on their phones, hoping the evidence might someday expose the truth. Catherine realized that fear had become stronger than justice. She clenched her fists and stepped forward once again. Looking directly at the eldest prince, she demanded that he stop treating another human being like an object. She reminded him that respect could never be forced through fear. If someone truly wished to become the future ruler, they first had to earn the trust of the people. Her words echoed through the terminal, but instead of reflecting on them, the prince laughed louder than before. The eldest prince proudly announced that ordinary people knew nothing about power. According to him, wealth and royal blood gave him the right to decide who deserved dignity and who did not. He believed that fear created obedience, and obedience created authority. His younger brother nodded in agreement, convinced that no one would ever dare challenge them once they officially inherited the throne. They even joked about how today's incident would soon be forgotten because no common citizen would risk testifying against the royal family. Listening to their conversation, Margaret felt a deep sadness she could hardly describe. During the years she had spent in Antarctica, she often dreamed of returning home and watching these children become honorable adults. Instead, she was witnessing the complete destruction of every lesson she had tried to teach them. The kindness she had once shown them had been replaced by arrogance, selfishness, and greed. At that moment, Charlotte quietly looked at Margaret again. Unlike her brothers, she could not completely ignore the strange feeling growing inside her. The elderly woman's calm voice, her knowledge of the life enzyme, and the sorrow in her eyes all seemed painfully genuine. Charlotte remembered how Margaret had spoken about creating the medicine specifically for a princess suffering from a rare disease. Very few people knew that information. The more she thought about it, the more uneasy she became. She softly asked her brother whether they should contact King Edward before making any further decisions. The eldest prince immediately dismissed the idea. He insisted that calling the king over an obvious fraud would only embarrass the royal family. Confident that he was right, he ordered everyone to stop questioning his judgment. Charlotte reluctantly fell silent again, allowing her uncertainty to be buried beneath loyalty to her brother. Meanwhile, inside the royal palace, King Edward's concern continued to grow. Margaret had never ignored his calls before. After 10 years apart, he expected her to contact him the moment she landed. Instead, every attempt to reach her ended without an answer. His instincts told him something was terribly wrong. Without wasting another minute, he ordered the royal convoy to leave immediately for the airport. Advisors tried to reassure him that the Queen was probably delayed by customs or security procedures, but Edward refused to believe it. He knew Margaret too well. She always placed duty before convenience, and she would never disappear without explanation. As the convoy rushed through the city streets, the king silently prayed that his fears were unfounded. He had no idea that the greatest danger facing his wife was not an accident or a stranger. It was the very children he had raised inside the royal palace. Back at the airport, the prince decided that humiliating Margaret was no longer enough. He wanted to destroy her completely. Smiling cruelly, he grabbed the metal case once again and waved it in front of the crowd. Margaret's heart immediately raced. She begged him not to damage it, explaining once more that the bottle inside represented 10 years of irreplaceable research. The prince mocked her desperation. He sarcastically asked whether the case contained magic that could suddenly transform a beggar into a queen. Without waiting for an answer, he tossed the case carelessly into the air before catching it again, treating the priceless scientific breakthrough like a worthless toy. Every movement made Margaret fear that the bottle inside might shatter. Catherine pleaded with him to stop, warning that if the contents were truly valuable, he could cause irreversible harm. The prince ignored every warning. To him, proving his superiority mattered far more than protecting something he did not understand. Margaret finally revealed another painful truth. Looking directly at Charlotte, she explained that the life enzyme had been created to save her life. There was only one bottle in existence because extracting even a single vial required years of dangerous work under impossible conditions. If it were destroyed, there would be no replacement for many years, perhaps not even within Margaret's lifetime. Charlotte's expression froze. She instinctively reached toward the case, but before she could speak, the eldest prince interrupted again. He accused Margaret of manipulating his sister by repeating information she had heard from the national news. According to him, every newspaper had already reported the Queen's scientific breakthrough. Anyone could pretend to know those details. Although Charlotte still looked uncertain, she reluctantly stepped back, allowing her brother to remain in control. The tension reached another frightening level when the prince suddenly declared that if Margaret refused to admit she was a fraud, he would smash the case in front of everyone. Gasps spread through the crowd. Catherine immediately moved in front of Margaret, determined to shield her if violence erupted again. Margaret gently held Catherine's arm and whispered that no matter what happened next, she must not blame herself. Some people, Margaret said quietly, become so blinded by power that they cannot recognize truth even when it stands before them. But truth has a way of revealing itself eventually. Those words carried a quiet confidence that contrasted sharply with the prince's arrogance. Unknown to everyone at the terminal, the royal convoy carrying King Edward was already speeding toward the airport. With every passing minute, the distance between justice and those responsible for the Queen's suffering grew smaller, and the moment of reckoning was drawing closer. The atmosphere inside the airport became heavier with every passing second. Nobody could believe that a simple misunderstanding had turned into such a horrifying display of cruelty. Travelers who had originally stopped to watch were now silently praying that someone would step in before the situation became even worse. Margaret stood quietly beside Catherine, her body weak but her spirit unbroken. Years of surviving the harsh Antarctic wilderness had taught her that true strength was not measured by physical power, but by the ability to endure suffering without losing compassion. Even after everything the adopted children had done, she still hoped they would realize the truth before committing a mistake that could never be undone. Looking at them carefully, she could hardly recognize the innocent children she had once helped raise. Their hearts had become consumed by ambition, and every decision they made was driven by the desire to gain the throne instead of earning it through honor. The eldest prince tightened his grip on the metal case and slowly walked around Margaret as though he had already won. Every step he took reflected complete confidence that no one could challenge him. He loudly reminded everyone present that he was the future king of Britain and that anyone who disobeyed him would eventually regret it. His younger brother immediately supported him, claiming that once they controlled the royal foundation, nobody would dare question their authority. The brothers openly discussed their future plans without showing the slightest concern for the frightened crowd listening nearby. They dreamed about unlimited wealth, greater political influence, and complete control over the kingdom's most important institutions. Not once did they mention serving the people or protecting the nation. Margaret listened silently, realizing that the throne meant nothing to them except personal power. At that painful moment, her decision became even stronger. No matter what happened after today, she would never allow people with such selfish hearts to inherit the kingdom. Charlotte stood several steps behind her brothers, watching the confrontation with growing discomfort. Unlike the others, she could not ignore the strange feeling inside her heart. Every time Margaret spoke, there was an honesty in her voice that seemed impossible to fake. The elderly woman's concern for the life enzyme also felt genuine. If she were truly an ordinary criminal pretending to be the queen, why would she care more about protecting a medicine than protecting herself? Charlotte remembered her father's words earlier that day. King Edward had sounded unusually serious when he warned them not to judge Margaret by appearances because 10 years in Antarctica had changed her dramatically. Those words echoed repeatedly in Charlotte's mind. She quietly glanced toward the metal case again, wondering whether her brothers had made a terrible mistake. But fear of disagreeing with the eldest prince kept her silent. Catherine noticed Charlotte's hesitation and decided to speak directly to her. In a calm but emotional voice, she asked the young princess to think carefully before allowing more harm to happen. Catherine explained that truly powerful people never needed to humiliate the weak to prove their strength. If there was even the slightest possibility that Margaret was telling the truth, they should stop immediately and verify her identity. Charlotte looked down at the ground, clearly struggling with her emotions. Before she could answer, however, the eldest prince interrupted once again. He accused Catherine of trying to manipulate his sister and warned Charlotte not to be fooled by what he called a desperate performance. According to him, hesitation would only make them look foolish in front of everyone. Once again, Charlotte allowed her brother's confidence to overpower her own doubts. At the same time, King Edward's convoy raced through the streets toward the airport. Police vehicles cleared traffic ahead while royal security officers prepared for the Queen's arrival. Inside the car, Edward stared silently through the window, unable to shake the growing fear in his heart. He remembered the day Margaret had left for Antarctica 10 years earlier. She had smiled bravely despite knowing the dangerous conditions she would face. Before boarding the research aircraft, she had promised to return only after completing the life enzyme. Edward had waited patiently through every lonely year, believing that their reunion would become one of the happiest days of their lives. Instead, he now felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Margaret had never ignored him before. Something was wrong, and every passing minute increased his anxiety. He ordered the driver to move even faster, unaware that his beloved wife was enduring unimaginable suffering only a short distance away. Back inside the terminal, the eldest prince decided that words alone were no longer enough. He wanted to completely destroy Margaret's hope. Holding the metal case high above his head, he announced that he would open it in front of everyone to expose the so-called fraud once and for all. Margaret instinctively stepped forward, her face filled with genuine panic. She begged him not to touch the contents. She explained once more that extracting a single bottle of the life enzyme required years of continuous work under impossible conditions. The freezing temperatures had permanently damaged her health, but she had accepted every sacrifice because she believed the medicine would save innocent lives. The prince only laughed harder. He mocked the idea that one small bottle could possibly be worth more than his sapphire necklace. To him, scientific achievement meant nothing compared to wealth and status. His complete ignorance deeply saddened Margaret, who realized that he had never understood the true meaning of responsibility. The crowd watched helplessly as the prince slowly unlocked the case. Margaret's breathing became faster. Catherine moved protectively beside her, prepared to intervene if necessary despite knowing she could never overpower the prince and his bodyguard. For several terrifying seconds, nobody moved. Then, just as the prince prepared to throw the contents onto the ground, a distant noise echoed through the airport entrance. The sound of approaching sirens and speeding vehicles caused several people to turn toward the doors. Airport security officers immediately became alert as the unmistakable arrival of a royal convoy drew closer. The adopted princes smiled confidently, believing the king's arrival would only confirm that they had successfully protected the royal family from an impostor. Margaret quietly closed her eyes for a brief moment. She knew that the truth was finally approaching. Very soon, every lie would collapse, every cruel action would be exposed, and those who believed themselves untouchable would be forced to face the consequences of everything they had done. None of them realized that the next few minutes would change the future of the royal family forever. The sound of approaching sirens instantly changed the atmosphere inside the airport. Travelers moved aside as security officers hurried toward the entrance, clearing a path for the royal convoy. The adopted princes smiled proudly, convinced that King Edward had arrived at the perfect moment to witness how they had supposedly protected the royal family from an impostor. The eldest prince straightened his clothes, adjusted his posture, and confidently held the damaged sapphire necklace in his hand, preparing to present himself as the victim. He believed that within a few minutes his father would praise him for defending the honor of the monarchy. Standing only a few feet away, Margaret remained completely silent. She did not celebrate the king's arrival or attempt to use her authority. Instead, she quietly watched the people she had once loved, hoping they would finally realize the terrible mistakes they had made before it was too late. As the convoy came to a stop outside the terminal, King Edward stepped out with a worried expression. Unlike the adopted children, he was not thinking about ceremonies or public appearances. His only concern was finding Margaret safely. The unanswered phone calls and strange silence since her flight landed had filled him with anxiety. Without waiting for his advisors, he hurried toward the terminal entrance while security officers followed closely behind. Every second felt painfully slow. Deep inside, Edward feared that something unexpected had happened during Margaret's journey home. He had imagined welcoming her with gratitude after 10 years of sacrifice, never expecting that she might already be suffering because of the very family they had raised together. Inside the terminal, the eldest prince noticed the king's arrival and immediately became excited. He quickly instructed his younger brother and Charlotte to stand beside him. They believed this was the perfect opportunity to impress their father before the queen arrived. The prince confidently rehearsed the story he intended to tell, planning to accuse Margaret of pretending to be Queen Margaret, damaging the royal gift, and creating chaos at the airport. James stood silently behind him, ready to support every false claim if necessary. None of them realized that the person they had insulted, threatened, and humiliated was standing only a few steps away. Their confidence came entirely from ignorance, and that ignorance was about to disappear forever. Margaret slowly looked toward the entrance where Edward was approaching. For a brief moment, countless memories returned to her mind. She remembered saying goodbye to him 10 years earlier before leaving for Antarctica. She remembered every letter they had exchanged during her research and every promise they had made about building a better future for the kingdom. Seeing him again after such a long separation should have been one of the happiest moments of her life. Instead, she stood there covered in dust, her clothes torn, her body bruised, and her heart deeply wounded. More painful than her physical injuries was the realization that the children she had helped raise had become strangers blinded by greed. Margaret did not feel anger toward Edward, but she knew that the truth he was about to discover would break his heart. Before Edward could reach them, the eldest prince rushed forward and respectfully bowed. Wearing the expression of an innocent victim, he immediately began accusing Margaret. He claimed that an elderly woman had deliberately destroyed the expensive sapphire necklace prepared for the queen and then pretended to be Her Majesty herself. He insisted that he had acted only to protect the dignity of the royal family. The younger brother quickly supported the same story, while James nodded in agreement. Their lies sounded polished because they believed no one could challenge them. Charlotte remained unusually quiet. She still felt uncertain, and every time she looked at Margaret, the doubt inside her heart became stronger. Something about the exhausted woman's calm silence seemed impossible to fake. Edward listened without interrupting, but something immediately felt wrong. The princes appeared far more concerned about a broken necklace than about finding Margaret. Even stranger, they never once asked whether the woman they had confronted was injured. Their version of events focused entirely on protecting their own reputation. As Edward's eyes slowly moved past his adopted children, they finally landed on the elderly woman standing beside Catherine. For a brief moment, he froze. Although years of harsh scientific work had changed her appearance dramatically, there was something unmistakably familiar about her eyes. They carried the same quiet determination he had admired throughout their years together. His heart began beating faster as disbelief filled his face. Margaret looked directly at Edward without speaking. She did not rush toward him or demand justice. Instead, she simply waited. The bruises on her face, the exhaustion in her expression, and the pain she had silently endured spoke louder than any accusation. Catherine stood protectively beside her, still unaware that the woman she had defended was truly the Queen of Britain. The airport fell completely silent as everyone watched the king and the mysterious woman staring at each other. The adopted princes smiled confidently, expecting Edward to order Margaret's immediate arrest. Instead, the king's expression slowly changed from confusion to shock. He took a hesitant step forward, unable to believe what he was seeing. At that very moment, the eldest prince suddenly noticed the metal case still resting nearby. Believing it contained nothing more than evidence of Margaret's deception, he reached for it once again. Margaret instinctively cried out, begging him not to touch it. Her voice carried genuine desperation because she knew the world's only life enzyme was still inside. Catherine immediately moved to stop him, but James blocked her path. For a split second, the entire terminal held its breath. The future of the priceless scientific discovery, the fate of the adopted children, and the truth that had remained hidden throughout the entire confrontation were all about to collide. The lies that had protected the princes for years were beginning to crumble, and the moment everyone had been waiting for was finally within reach. As the airport terminal stood frozen in silence, King Edward slowly walked toward the injured woman. Every step felt heavier than the last. His eyes remained fixed on Margaret's face, searching beyond the bruises, the torn clothes, and the exhaustion that years of sacrifice had carved into her appearance. Then he saw it, the familiar kindness in her eyes that no hardship could ever erase. The expression he had looked into countless times before she left for Antarctica. His breathing stopped for a moment. "Margaret," he whispered almost inaudibly. The entire terminal fell silent. The adopted children looked at one another in confusion, unable to understand why their father suddenly looked so pale. They had expected praise for protecting the royal family, not a king standing speechless before the woman they had spent the last hour humiliating. Catherine also stared at Edward in disbelief. Until that moment, she had only trusted Margaret because of her honesty and dignity. Now she realized the impossible was true. The elderly woman she had defended was not pretending to be the queen. She truly was Queen Margaret. Without caring about the people surrounding him, Edward rushed toward Margaret and gently supported her before she lost her balance. The moment he noticed the injuries covering her arms and face, his heart shattered. His voice trembled as he asked who had dared to harm her. Margaret looked at him quietly for several seconds before giving a gentle smile. Even after everything she had suffered, there was no hatred in her expression. She simply looked tired. Edward carefully held her hands, but the moment he touched them, he noticed fresh injuries across her fingers. Those were not ordinary wounds. They were the hands of the scientist who had spent 10 years creating the life enzyme. Margaret softly explained that the adopted children had repeatedly tried to take the metal case away from her and had threatened to destroy the only vial in existence. Edward slowly turned toward the princes. His face no longer showed worry. It showed disbelief mixed with overwhelming disappointment. The eldest prince immediately realized the situation was slipping out of his control. He hurried forward, insisting that Margaret had deceived everyone by pretending to be the queen. He argued that they had acted only to protect the royal family from an impostor. The younger brother quickly repeated the same explanation, while James confirmed every word. They desperately hoped the king would believe them instead of Margaret. But Edward remained completely silent. He simply stared at them with eyes filled with sorrow. These were the children he had welcomed into the palace, educated with the finest teachers, and loved as members of his own family. Never in his worst nightmares had he imagined they would become people capable of attacking an elderly woman, especially the queen who had sacrificed 10 years of her life for them. Charlotte could no longer remain silent. Tears slowly filled her eyes as she stepped forward and looked at Margaret again. Every word the queen had spoken earlier suddenly made perfect sense. She remembered Margaret saying the life enzyme had been created to save a princess suffering from a rare disease. She remembered her warning that destroying the bottle would destroy Charlotte's only chance to recover. Most painfully, She remembered the quiet sadness in Margaret's voice when she spoke about losing the ability to have children after years of scientific research. Charlotte realized that everything had been true from the very beginning. She slowly fell to her knees, unable to look Margaret in the eyes. Her voice shook as she apologized over and over again, but Margaret remained silent. Some wounds could not be healed with simple words. Edward then noticed Catherine standing beside Margaret. Security officers quickly explained that Catherine had risked her own career to protect the injured woman when everyone else remained silent. They described how she had repeatedly challenged the princes despite knowing they could destroy her future. Edward looked at Catherine with deep respect. In the middle of fear and injustice, she had been the only person willing to stand beside the queen without expecting any reward. Margaret quietly nodded, confirming that Catherine had protected her from the very beginning. The king's expression softened. He thanked Catherine personally for her courage, promising that the kingdom would never forget what she had done. Catherine lowered her head respectfully, explaining that she had simply followed her conscience. She believed no innocent person should ever be abandoned, regardless of status or wealth. The attention of everyone inside the terminal then shifted toward the metal case lying nearby. Edward carefully picked it up and slowly opened it. Inside rested the precious vial containing the world's only life enzyme. Seeing it still intact, Margaret finally released the breath she had been holding for so long. The adopted children looked at the bottle with shocked expressions. For the first time, they truly understood what they had almost destroyed. That single vial represented 10 years of sacrifice, countless medical breakthroughs, and Charlotte's only hope of survival. The realization hit them like a storm. Their selfish ambition had nearly cost innocent lives simply because they had judged someone by appearance instead of truth. Edward slowly closed the case and turned back toward his adopted children. His voice remained calm, but the disappointment behind every word was impossible to ignore. He reminded them that becoming a ruler was never about wealth, pride, or expensive gifts. A true leader protected the weak, respected the law, and accepted responsibility for every decision. Instead, they had abused their authority, humiliated an innocent woman, ignored justice, and allowed arrogance to guide every action. Looking at them now, Edward realized they had already proven themselves completely unworthy of inheriting the throne. Margaret quietly watched the painful scene unfold. She had once dreamed of seeing these children become wise leaders. Instead, they had destroyed that dream with their own choices. As royal security officers surrounded the area, the atmosphere changed completely. The confidence that had filled the adopted princes only minutes earlier disappeared. For the first time, genuine fear appeared on their faces. They finally understood that the woman they had insulted, beaten, and humiliated was not a helpless stranger, but the queen herself, the very person whose respect they had been trying to win. More importantly, they realized their actions had been witnessed by dozens of people. The lies that had protected them for years were collapsing before everyone's eyes. Although the final judgment had not yet been announced, everyone present understood one simple truth. Justice had finally arrived, and the consequences of their cruelty were only beginning. The airport terminal remained completely silent as every pair of eyes turned toward King Edward. The truth had finally come into the light, and there was no longer any room for excuses or deception. The adopted princes, who only minutes earlier had proudly declared themselves above the law, now stood frozen with fear. Their confidence had disappeared, replaced by panic as they realized that every cruel action had been witnessed by the king himself. Margaret remained quietly beside Catherine, still exhausted from everything she had endured. Although justice was finally within reach, there was no joy on her face. She had never wanted revenge. She had only hoped that the children she once loved would grow into honorable people. Sadly, their own greed had destroyed that hope long before she returned home. King Edward slowly looked at each of the adopted children. His voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of a king whose trust had been completely shattered. He reminded them that royal titles were never rewards for ambition or privilege. They were responsibilities that demanded wisdom, compassion, humility, and respect for every citizen. Instead of protecting the weak, they had bullied an injured woman. Instead of respecting justice, they had believed their power placed them above the law. Worst of all, They had humiliated the very queen who had sacrificed 10 years of her life for the kingdom and nearly destroyed the only life enzyme capable of saving innocent lives. Edward admitted that the greatest mistake was not theirs alone. He blamed himself for failing to recognize how pride and unchecked privilege had corrupted the children he had raised. His disappointment was far greater than his anger because he had truly believed they would become worthy leaders one day. The eldest prince immediately fell to his knees and begged for forgiveness. The younger brother quickly followed, while Charlotte stood silently with tears streaming down her face. They desperately insisted that they had not recognized Margaret because the years in Antarctica had changed her appearance completely. They claimed they had acted only because they believed she was an imposter. But Edward shook his head. He explained that appearances had never been the real problem. The true problem was their hearts. Even if Margaret had been an ordinary traveler, nothing could justify humiliating, beating, and threatening a defenseless woman. A ruler who treated powerless people with cruelty would eventually treat the entire nation the same way. Their behavior had revealed the kind of leaders they would become, and that truth could no longer be ignored. Margaret finally spoke after remaining silent for so long. Her voice was gentle despite everything she had suffered. She told Edward that punishment should never come from anger, but from justice. She admitted that seeing the adopted children fall so far from the values she had once taught them broke her heart more than any physical injury. She reminded them that true nobility was never inherited through blood or titles. It was earned through kindness, honesty, and responsibility. Wealth could disappear overnight, and power could be taken away in an instant, but a person's character would always remain. Looking directly at Charlotte, Margaret expressed genuine sadness that fear and blind loyalty had prevented her from trusting her own conscience. She hoped that one day Charlotte would learn to stand for what was right, even when doing so was difficult. Edward then ordered royal investigators to review everything that had happened at the airport. Security footage, eyewitness statements, and the recordings made by passengers clearly confirmed Margaret's account. Every insult, every threat, every act of violence, and every abuse of authority had been captured. There was no possibility of hiding the truth any longer. Following the investigation, Edward announced that all royal privileges, succession rights, and honorary titles held by the adopted princes would be revoked immediately. None of them would ever become heir to the throne. Furthermore, they would face legal consequences as ordinary citizens because the law applied equally to everyone, regardless of birth or status. The announcement shocked everyone present. For the first time in many years, the royal family publicly demonstrated that justice was stronger than privilege. Edward then turned toward Catherine, the woman who had risked everything to defend a stranger. He praised her courage before everyone gathered at the airport. While others remained silent out of fear, Catherine had chosen compassion over personal safety. She had protected Margaret without knowing she was the queen and had repeatedly reminded the princes that no one stood above the law. Margaret smiled warmly at Catherine and personally thanked her for restoring her faith in humanity during one of the darkest moments of her life. As a symbol of gratitude, Edward announced that Catherine would receive the kingdom's highest civilian honor for bravery and integrity. She was also offered an important position within the royal foundation, where her honesty and sense of justice could serve the nation. Overwhelmed with emotion, Catherine humbly accepted the recognition, insisting that she had only done what any decent person should have done. Several days later, the Royal Foundation held the long-awaited international press conference. Scientists, doctors, journalists, and government leaders from around the world gathered to witness Queen Margaret officially introduce the life enzyme. Standing before the audience, Margaret spoke not only about the scientific achievement, but also about the responsibility that comes with knowledge and power. She explained that every discovery should exist to improve human lives rather than satisfy personal ambition. She thanked the medical teams who had supported her research and dedicated the breakthrough to every patient who continued fighting against rare diseases. The audience responded with a standing ovation, celebrating not only her scientific success, but also her remarkable strength, dignity, and forgiveness after everything she had endured. The airport incident soon became one of the most discussed stories in the country. People praised the king's decision to place justice above family loyalty and admired Queen Margaret's extraordinary compassion. Catherine became a symbol of courage, proving that one ordinary person could make an extraordinary difference simply by refusing to ignore injustice. Meanwhile, the adopted children were left to reflect on the consequences of their own choices. They had lost everything they once believed guaranteed their future, not because of bad luck, but because of their own arrogance, greed, and cruelty. In the end, Queen Margaret's greatest victory was never the creation of the life enzyme. It was proving that kindness remains stronger than hatred, humility outlasts pride, and truth eventually defeats every lie. Her journey reminded everyone that real greatness is measured not by crowns, wealth, or titles, but by the sacrifices we make for others and the compassion we show to those who cannot defend themselves. And so, this unforgettable story comes to a close with a powerful lesson that echoes far beyond the walls of the royal palace. Cruelty may seem powerful for a moment, but in the end, it always destroys itself, while kindness leaves behind a legacy that inspires generations to come.